the International Soccer Preview. We are Soccer Files Canada. Welcome to Series 20, the 2023 African Cup. This episode is part 2 on the players of Guinea-Bissau, the final selections. Here we go. Hello and welcome back to the International Soccer Preview by Soccer Files Canada. We are back for part 2 of our mediacast on the players of the 2023 African Cup, played in January 2024. This episode deals with the final selections of Guinea-Bissau. In part 1, we compiled a list of players and their likelihood of reaching the final squad, and that was based mostly on their participation over usually the past 2 years. We did consider a few other factors as well. In fact, we ran out of time to do part 2 for some of the smaller teams of the African Cup. So today we're going back to review that to complete the collection, as it were. The tournament has been played by this point, but we're going to take the perspective of just before the tournament here, as if we were doing the media cast when we intended to. This media cast then is divided into 3 sections. Section 1 is some preliminary information, including a look at the games played after we did part 1. Section 2 is the main part of the media cast, a review of the lineup, a review of the selections that were released. And we're going to compare those to the list that we compiled in part 1. And in section 3, we will review new players, surprise selections, non-selections, and injuries. And we'll end with a revised list of who we think will be starters. Just a quick word on our future plans. In the fall of 2024, we started our review of qualifications for the World Cup. And we talked about other tournaments like the next African Cup, which is at the end of 2025. We did actually do a preview for the preliminary round of Asian Cup qualifying there in the fall of 2023. But overall, we were a bit ambitious, and we're going to have to put off our coverage of qualification until 2025. But stay tuned for an update. We'll probably try to do some of that in the spring of 2025. Okay, let's get back on topic and jump right in. So section 1, we're going to just do some introductory material. The squad, well, they are allowed to put 27 players on the squad list, and Guinea-Bissau put out a 39-man preliminary squad. So that means they have to cut 12 players. 12 players will have made the preliminary squad, but not the final squad. Let's take a look at some of the games. They had 2 World Cup qualifiers in November. And the teams they played there are Burkina Faso and Djibouti. We're not really interested in the results here. We're more interested in the lineups that they put out. They also had 1 pre-tournament friendly. That was against Mali. They kind of lost humiliatingly there, 6-2. But again, we're not really interested in the score, but the lineup. So as we go through the positions, we'll take a look, and that'll kind of inform us on what to expect during the tournament. All right, let's move on to section 2 and then the candidates. So this is the list. If you're watching the YouTube version of this, the list that we created in part 1. And now let's go through it and see. We have Bakiro Kande as the manager. Sorry, I just got to get back on the right page here. Yes, Bakiro Kande as the manager, and no changes there, so we will view him as having been selected for the squad. And then, yes, if you want more information on these candidates, we did that in the 2021 African Cup preview, and a little less so in part 1 here. But that is not our business here. We're just looking at who is selected for the squad. So we had Jonas Mendes as a likely candidate for goalkeeper. And then we had 3 possible candidates. That's Manuel Balde, Selton Baya, and Uparin Joko. We also had Maurice Gomez as seemingly off the squad. Let's take a look and see what happened. Well, we have Jonas Mendes, not only selected, but captain of the team there. So our likely candidate was selected. Selton Baya, a bit of a story here. He was selected, at least for the preliminary squad, and I didn't kind of indicate whether he was called up to the final squad or not, but at some point during the process, he declined the invitation in order to focus on club play. He plays for Vitória Guimarães in Portugal, and declined the invitation there. So he is out. Manuel Balde, the possible candidate, was selected for the preliminary squad but did not make the final cut there. However, Uparin Joko did make the final squad. So that leaves us with two goalkeepers. The third goalkeeper is not Maurice Gomez. He is indeed off the squad. But the third one is a new candidate by the name of Fernando Mbadi, who is selected to the final squad. So a little information about him since he's new. Fernando Mbadi does not have any caps for Guinea-Bissau. He is 20 years old. Maybe 21 years old, and he plays for a very small club in Spain called Lugo Polvorin since 2023. So he was not born in Portugal, actually, but is playing for clubs in Portugal. So Fernando Mbadi getting his start for the team. So there we go, the three goalkeepers, Jonas Mendes, Uparin Joko, and Fernando Mbadi. Let's take a look at the games that they played to see if we can figure out who's going to be the starter. I think in the previous draft, we were quite sure that Jonas Mendes was going to be the starter, but actually a little doubt shed on that with the selections in November. The first game against Burkina Faso, it was Uparin Joko who played, but then the second game against Djibouti, it was Jonas Mendes. Their most recent friendly had Joko as the starter again. So we're going to have to change our view to maybe one or the other, or a rotation of the two. But we'll kind of come back to that at the end when we do the spotlight review. Let's move on to central defense then. And we had, for central defenders, a definite candidate in Opa Sangante, a likely candidate, or two likely candidates, Marcelo Giallo and Nito Gomez. And then we had four possible candidates, Sori Mane, Edgar Le, Pedro Justiniano, and Baba Fernandez. Now, we think they usually bring 4 or 5 central defenders, but a bit more complicated with Guinea-Bissau because sometimes players shift around their position. As you can see on this list, if you're looking at the YouTube one, because Sori Mane is actually coded as a central midfielder and has played in that position before, but he played more as a central defender in recent times. Anyway, let's look at these candidates and see which ones made it. We have Opa Sangante as a selection for the final squad. The first of the likely candidates, Marcelo Giallo, also selected, and actually so was the other likely candidate, Nito Gomez. Among the 4 possible candidates, we do have Sori Mane selected, but we actually moved him back to central midfield. I'll have to tell you why later. I'm guessing that recently he has played more in central midfield, so kind of jumping back and forth. So we'll remove him from the list here and come back to him. So Edgar Le, the first or the possible candidate, was selected. However, Pedro Justiniano and Baba Fernandez not even selected for the preliminary squad there. So 4 central defenders, but as we said, sometimes other players coming in, playing out of position. Let's look at the lineups that we saw to try to determine the starters. And in the two World Cup qualifiers in November, it was Opa Sangante along with Marcelo Giallo starting those games, and that was the case too with the friendly against Mali. So we can be fairly confident that Sangante and Giallo will be the starting pair. And by the way, they did go with a four-man defense in all three of those games, as Guinea-Bissau usually does. So just two central defenders, along with a left back and a right back. So we turn our attention now to the left back position, and we had a likely candidate in Fali Kande. And again, in part one, we explained why we thought he was likely, or why we put the players in the categories we did. We also had a possible candidate in Sana Gomez there. And okay, so Fali Kandi did make the squad. He was selected for the final squad. And Sana Gomez, only as far as the preliminary squad goes, did he make it. We didn't talk about him in part one, Prosper Mendy, because he was a possible but unlikely candidate, and we didn't put players who were that unlikely on the list. So we didn't do that. But since he was selected not only for the preliminary squad, but the final squad, we now add Prosper Mendy to the list, and we'll talk a little bit about him, just to introduce him. He's been with Guinea-Bissau since 2022 with one cap, and he's 28 years old. Born in France, but plays for Kaysar in Kazakhstan since 2023, and a team in Bulgaria before that. So he did get his first cap in September 2022. And was on the bench for 3 games in 2023, but hadn't been selected for the last 4 matches. So we had coded him as possible but unlikely, but here he is, having made the squad. Okay, let's look at the left-back position in the games they've played. I'm now feeling that Fali Kande is pretty much a shoe-in for the position, and Prosper Mendy a backup. But let's take a look. Actually, we have an out-of-position player, Nanu, who we'll meet soon, playing as left-back in that first November game. But it was Fali Kandi in the second game against Djibouti, and also in the friendly against Mali pre-tournament. So, yes, we can be fairly confident that Fali Kandi Fali Kande is the starter. What we can learn from that is that rather than Prosper Mendy being the backup, it seems to be an out-of-position player favoured. But we only have one game as evidence for that, and we'll see when the cup comes. Okay, over to the right-back position. We had 2 likely candidates. One of them, Jefferson Nkada, and the other we just met as filling in at left-back there, Nanu. So 2 likely candidates there, and we had a possible candidate in Houbelang Mendes. And again, there were other candidates at the possible but unlikely or seemingly off the squad level that we didn't introduce. None of those came into play. So we have our 2 likely candidates, Jefferson and Kada, and Nanu, both making the squad. And also the possible candidate, Houbelang Mendes, also selected for the final squad. Looking at the games, we see that Jefferson and Kada started against Burkina Faso in the first game. But they gave Houbelang Mendes a tryout against Djibouti there, but unfortunately he got 2 yellow cards and a red card in the game, and I actually wonder if that'll carry over into the cup, maybe disallowing him for the first game. So no surprise that in the friendly against Mali, they came back to Jefferson Nkada, who does look like he'll be the starter. We'll get to that in the spotlight review where we predict the starters at the end. But a bit of a change in in our thinking there. Okay, on to midfield, and we'll jump straight to defensive midfielders. We only had one candidate there, and that was at the likely level, and that is Bura. I have his name as Bura Noguera. Noguera. Anyway, it doesn't matter much because he was not selected for the squad. So no players coded as defensive midfielders. So it looks like central midfielders will fill in the spot. And that is what Sori Mane is coded as, even though he does sometimes play as a defender. He did in all 3 games of the 2021 African Cup, but he's coded as a central midfielder and played that way in the 2019 African Cup. So I'm guessing we put him back as central midfielder because he played that position in some of the 8 games that we looked at in part 1. Anyway, Sori Mane is a likely candidate there. I'll put him actually at the top there. And we have Alpha Semedo also as a likely candidate. And Janio Bickel, also a likely candidate. So 3 likely candidates there, covering, I suppose, the defensive midfielder role. We also had a possible candidate in Moreto Kasama, who was a possible candidate. I think I had something to say there, but it has exited my brain. So let's go back and look and see who made it. Actually, all of them did. Sori Mane, Alpha Semedo, and Janio Bickel, the 3 likely candidates, and also the possible candidate Moreto Kasama. All 4 of them selected for the final squad. We did have a player who was seemingly off the squad selected for the preliminary squad, but we won't get into those players since we didn't introduce them in part 1. But there we are, 4 central midfielders. Let's take a look at the games and see what we have there. We actually have a 4-1-4-1 in the game against Burkina Faso. It was Sori Mane playing the stopper role. So there you can see he's more of a defensive midfielder for sure. And then playing ahead of him in the center, Alpha Semedo and Janio Bickel. So our 3 likely candidates all on the field there against Burkina Faso. In the second game, it was changed up quite a bit. It was a 4-3-3 formation. And we have Carlos, well, a couple of players we haven't introduced, so we'll just leave them off. But on the left side of the midfield there, we see Janio Bickel again. So a bit of a change there. When we get to the friendly against Mali, we have a 4-3-3 also. Here it's Alpha Semedo in the center of the field and Janio Bickel on the left again. And we'll talk about Dalcio Gomez coming up here. But we do see actually 3 players who we haven't met yet playing in that midfield. So let's move on. And 2 left midfielders. I just need to pause for a moment here. Okay, so we have as left midfielders Mauro Rodriguez as a likely candidate. And yes, we had 2 players seemingly off the squad, but because they were fairly big names, we put them on the list. But it was Pele and Steve Ambry. Neither of those selected for the squad, so they seem to be off the squad now. And Mauro Rodriguez is the only one left. Actually, I am more and more seeing him on my websites listed as Texera. So we'll have to change that name. So you may see the name Texera given rather than Mauro Rodriguez. I just want, I'll go over and do right midfielders because actually we didn't have any candidates there. And we're going to move over to left wingers and right wingers here before we look at the games again. Here we had a likely candidate in Piketty, but surprisingly, he was just named to the preliminary squad, but not the final squad. And that's all we had for players coded as left wingers, or he's actually a left attacking midfielder. We also had a player seemingly or possible but unlikely who made the preliminary squad. We won't get into those details. So let's go over to the right wing, where we had a likely candidate in Dalcio and a possible candidate in Carlos Mendes Gomez. Both of those were selected for the squad, and they were among the midfielders in the games we'll come back to. Carlos Mendes Gomez, the possible candidate, also selected for the squad. Now we'll go back and look at the games, because those players kind of filled in the midfield. As we saw in the first game, it was the three likely candidates we had as central midfielders. In game 2 against Djibouti, it was Carlos Gomez there, who was the central midfielder in the 4-3-3, and then Nito Gomez. His name hasn't come up yet, but we'll get to him if he was selected. Then against Mali, we have Dalcio Gomez playing as the right midfielder there. So both of these players represented. Okay, that is it for the wingers. We move on to forwards, beginning with attacking midfielders. And here we had a possible candidate in Carlos Mane, and then we had that was a likely candidate in Carlos Mane, and then we had 3 possible candidates in Jorginho, João Maria, and Famana Quizera. Let's take a look and see which of those made it. Carlos Mane was selected for the final squad. Jorginho only selected for the preliminary squad, didn't make the final cut there. And João Mario not even selected for the preliminary squad. However, the last of them, Famana Quizero, did make the final squad there. And among attacking midfielders, we did have 3 players who we had on our list as possible, but unlikely. We didn't introduce them in part 1. Those 3 players only made the preliminary squad, but not the final squad, so no need to introduce them here. We're going to move on to forwards, since it is a 4-3-3 formation, so these players will probably show up playing as left and right forwards. But let's look at centre forward, since we don't have any secondary strikers on the list. For forwards, we had a likely candidate in Mama Balde, and 5 possible candidates in on the list here. So the first one, Francolino Jew, João Pedro is the second, Zinho Gano is the third, and Jardel Silva the fourth, and Marciano Sanca the 5th candidate. Let's take a look and see who was selected. Of course, Mama Balde, no surprise there. I'm not even sure why we had him as a likely, but we'd have to go back to part 1 to see the justification for that. Francolino Jew, the first of our possible candidates, was selected. The next one, João Pedro, selected for the preliminary squad, but not the final squad. Thirdly, Zinho Gano was selected for the final squad. Jardel Silva, not selected even for the preliminary squad there. And finally, Marciano Sanca, whose name I've since I've added Chami to his name, because he's referred to that way on some of the websites. Chami begins with Tchami, and we'll see when we get to the cup what he is actually called. We also have not a new candidate, but he was on our possible but unlikely list. but who was selected for the final squad, and that is Zayturbo. Zayturbo, that's a nickname referring unsurprisingly to his speed. His real name is Jose Carrera, but on most of the sites I'm looking at, they go by his nickname. And just to note, no, I won't. We also have some players who made it onto the preliminary squad, but not the final squad. But that's beyond our scope here. So let us look and see what we saw in the games. So in game one, again, a 4-1-4-1 formation. And among these players, we see Francolino Jew playing as the sole forward there. I forgot to say in the last one that the wingers there were Manuel Balde on the left and Dalcio on the right. But for the forwards, Francolino Jew, so the possible candidate there. In the game against Djibouti, the 2nd November name, it was João Pedro, who ultimately wasn't selected, playing as the center of a three-man forward line, Famara Quizera on the right and Mauro Rodriguez, or Texera, on the left there. However, João Pedro was not selected there. And finally, against Mali, also a three-man forward line. And here we see what we kind of expected, Mama Balde on the in the center of a three-man forward line, Carlos Mane on the left, and surprisingly, Sori Mane kind of all over the field here. I've introduced him as a defensive midfielder, but he's been in central defense. Well, here against Mali, he's playing as a right forward. So goodness knows where we're going to see him on the field in the end. Okay, that brings us to the end of part 2. So let's take a look at part 3 and go over some of the surprises here. Just before I do that, I want to add one name to the list because I forgot a new forward that had been added to the list. That is Zidane Baniagui, and he has no caps for Guinea-Bissau. He plays for Aves in Portugal, but actually his name has come up in the past. He was on the preliminary squad for the 2021 African Cup, but not selected for that and hadn't appeared since then. So there we have it, Zidane Baniagui, a further forward. That makes it 6 forwards, 6 players as coded as forwards for them there. And let's move on now to the section 3. So notable non-selections, we have 2. The first one is Bura, the defensive midfielder, or Bura Nogueira. We had as a likely candidate, but he was not selected even for the preliminary squad, so a bit of a surprise there. Again, if you want to know why we had him as a likely candidate, we covered that in part 1. Next is Piketty, the left attacking midfielder. Bura, by the way, the defensive midfielder, the only defensive midfielder they had by the way he was coded. Piketty, a left attacking midfielder. We also had him as a likely candidate. He did make the preliminary squad, but not the final cut there. So that too, a bit of a surprise, especially since he was part of the last 3 African Cups for Guinea-Bissau. Let's move on to surprise inclusions. Actually, they were on our list, both of them at the possible but unlikely level. So we hadn't included them in part 1, but here they are selected for the final squad. That is left back Prosper Mendy, and then the forward Zayturbo, who may be called Jose Carrera. Both of those selected for the final squad. I don't think we introduced Zayturbo or Jose Carrera, so we'll do that quickly now. He's been with Guinea-Bissau since 2023 with 2 caps, and he is 28 years old, and he plays for Paris NN in Russia. I don't even know that team. We'll just say he plays in Russia. He played in Qatar before that, but more significantly, he was with Inter Milan's youth team, Inter Milan in Italy there, from 2015 to 2018. He had not been selected for the last 3 matches. He had shown up during 2023, so had Prosper Mendy. Prosper Mendy hadn't been selected for the last 4 matches, so we considered both of them unlikely. Let's go to new players. We have goalkeeper Fernando Mbadi as a new player. We introduced him there, and the other one, Zidane Banyagui, also as a new player. He is an attacking midfielder. Not much to update on injuries. I think we did mention that Carlos Mane was injured for the last 3 matches up until the time we did the last mediacast. But as we saw, he played in the November games. He played in the game against Djibouti as a left attacking forward there, and also in the game against Mali. So, that was just in the game against Mali that he came back. Anyway, that does show that he is fit. Okay, let's go to our spotlight review. Well, this is what we did back in part 1. Let's see if we can update it based on the information we have. So Bakiro Kande, the manager, we considered him a starter, so let's go with that. And we had Jonas Mendes as the starting keeper. We've kind of lost a bit of confidence in that since Jacko started 2 of the games. So Uparin Joko. So now we have to say it'll be one or the other, or even a shared position for them. Uparin Joko starting 2 of the last 3 games. So creating doubt among us there. We're still fairly confident about Opa Sangante as a starting central defender. And now we changed Marcelo Diallo. We had him as a maybe, but now we're more confident that he will be a starting central defender. Over on the right side, there's really not many options other than Fali Kande. We do have Prosper Mendes now, and we did see Nanu kind of filling in for him in one of the recent games, but we think Fali Kande the only call as a left back there, as a starting left back. On the right side, we didn't have anyone, and I'm surprised we didn't in part 1. We should have at least said it's either Jefferson and Kande or Nanu. That's what we're going to go with here. We'll put them both on there, but actually now we're much more in favor of Jefferson and Nkada as the starting right back. So I'll put him in green and Nanu in blue. Nanu kind of looks like the backup on both sides. In the central midfield, we saw a big variety of players being used over the last 3 games, the 2 World Cup games in November and the friendly in pre-tournament friendly. Nobody really showed up enough for us to designate a starter, except for Bickle, because he played in all 3 games. So we're gonna nominate Janio Bickle as a likely starter. We did have him as a possible starter. I'm still keen on Alpha Semedo, but I think he only played one of those 3 games, and then a lot of other candidates besides. So we can't say with much confidence. Dalcio Gomez is listed as a left winger or a left attacking midfielder, and we had him as a starter before. We still think so. On the right wing, no one has really emerged except maybe Carlos Mane. So I'll put him in blue as the right attacking midfielder, but not that confident it will be him. There we go. And because there are other players like Texera who might vie for the position there. So moving on to the forward line, we had Mama Balde. He's still our most likely candidate, but we did see Francolino Jew making a bit of a bid as a starter. He played as the sole forward in the game against Burkina Faso. So I would say that we favor Mama Balde right now, but wouldn't be surprised to see Jew there. I'm just trying to find his name here. So we'll put them both in blue because we're not confident that either of them will be the starter, but we do think one of them will be. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of part 2. It's a bit long in coming, but I'm glad we've kind of completed the file so that we can look back on it before the next African Cup. So there we have it, the selections for Guinea-Bissau, and thank you very much. We will see you next time. We would like to thank Pixabay and Alexei Ivanov of Mappa Music for the wonderful background music accompanying this mediacast.